Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Modern and Modest with myself, Noshina Ghani. Well, today we bring you a rather unusual topic of discussion on our show today, which would be extremely beneficial to you, and we'd like to discuss gender-based violence here in South Africa. Now, we all are aware that 2018 started out with a lot of positivity, where gender-based violence, people have become more aware of it, and we found that it had taken, not just in South Africa, but it took off in many cities around the world, where people took to slogans like #MeToo or #TimesUp. Now, this was a great initiative where women were being able to stand up for themselves, reclaim their power, and just not feel afraid to be able to step out and speak about issues like these that tend to affect them. But what we find is that very little effective action has taken place from 2018 to date, given the rather distressing incident that just took place with the 19-year-old student in Cape Town. So today we're going to be speaking to Lubna Nadvi, who is a lecturer and an activist at UKZN, and she'd be able to give us more insight on how do we take charge of situations like gender-based violence, or how do we actually avoid being in these situations. Assalamu alaikum, Lubna, and welcome to Modern and Modest.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you so much for having me.
It's indeed a pleasure having someone like you to be able to perhaps raise more awareness to our female viewers and also assist us with how we could put a stop to gender-based violence. So Lubna, before we get into this discussion, maybe share a little bit more about yourself, what it is that you do, and how long have you been involved in this?
Sure. So I'm an academic based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I am a trained political scientist. So I teach in the field of politics, and one of the sort of areas I do focus on is gender and women's studies in relation to my academic work. I also research in the area, and I am active in terms of work that I do in the community. So it's a sort of a very multi-layered work that I do. In terms of my activism relating to gender-based violence, I'm also associated with an organization called the Advice Desk for the Abused, which has been around for just over 30 years. And it was started really in the 1980s at a time when domestic violence was there, but it wasn't actually being dealt with through the courts or through the legal system. And so it is an organization that has evolved over a period of time and now assists people across the board, with all kinds of issues of abuse and violence, and not just gender-based violence, but it does focus primarily on women and girl children who do experience violence. So the work is quite varied, and of course we partner with various other organizations. We partner with the Department of Justice, for example. We have a presence at all the court sites, so members of the public can actually go to the court sites if they, for example, require a protection order or any kind of service. So there's a sort of a system in place that is there to actually assist people looking for the assistance.
So Lubna, do you find many people contact this organization for assistance? Do you find more people are able to speak about the issues that they're experiencing?
Well, yes, it is one of many organizations, but it is actually one of the oldest. So there are people who are seeking help more frequently. And unfortunately, the incidence, the prevalence of gender-based violence has increased. In the sort of early 90s, as we were moving into a democratic dispensation, you did see violence, but it has escalated and it has reached actually epidemic proportions now. So there are various other organizations that do exist, but the Advice Desk sees a lot of cases, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 a year, and of course it's across all the different court sites and different kinds of cases that we're seeing. One of the challenges that we have found is that people, while they might seek assistance, they may not actually know what exactly to do. For example, if someone has been raped or is a victim of violence, very often they don't actually know what to do, and so we try and also spread information. We do information sharing, training, advocacy, and so that is very important. It's not just enough to be available for assistance, but you need to disseminate the information to anybody who needs to know what to do in the case of a gender-based violence situation.
Now we know that there's been at least almost 4% increase with stats with rape cases that have been reported, and it's great that you chatted about that because there are so many that have been unreported. We also find that, unfortunately, it's the sad truth that I think about 46% of this is made up of children. Now, what would you say? I mean, do we find that children are maybe exposed to to these types of violence? Maybe they are witness to it, or maybe they're experiencing it. So how would you be able to assist children in that perspective? Because they're either exposed to it at schools or perhaps communities, and maybe it's accepted. So how would you then approach children to get them to understand that there is help, and what you're having to witness isn't necessarily what you have to carry forward?
We live in a very violent society, and that is a reality that we cannot escape. So, and also the family structures have broken down. So a lot of children are not necessarily receiving parental guidance or any kind of adult supervision as they should be. Very often children are left to their own devices. But even children who have parents or adults supervising them very often may be walking, for example, from home to school on their own, taking public transport. And so there are periods where they are actually exposed to risk. They can be abducted. They could just simply, even at school, be exposed to violence. Schools, unfortunately, have now become very unsafe places because, of these predatory types of individuals that may be hanging around outside of school. There are now weapons that are being sort of brought into school. There's drugs that are circulating. There are so many risks that are out there. With children, for example, there are many sort of measures that the government and the judiciary have put in place. So, for example, you have a sort of a child rights charter that protects the right of children. There's legislation that specifically protects children, and there's things like the advocate or the family advocate office, which you can go to for children. But in terms of minors, what we need to do is actually educate them very early on in school. So we have been advocating at the advice desk and through our partners to try and get the Department of Education to actually introduce some kind of educational program at a very early age, even starting at creche level or pre-primary, to say to young children, and a lot of these programs are actually there, for example, to teach children no means no, that you have a right to say no to someone, an adult, who is touching you and making you feel uncomfortable. So there are these kinds of programs, but it needs to be a systematic sort of curriculum that starts at creche level, goes up to primary, goes up to secondary, and even it carries on at university level. And we need that kind of education for children starting off very early on, so they know that this is what they need to do to protect themselves. What are the measures or mechanisms required to stay safe? And it actually has to be an institutionalized part of our school curriculum.
Well, it's great that you mentioned from creche level, because there's probably so many issues that happen in a child's life from the tender age of perhaps, 3 or 4, because they can't say much and they don't know any better, and they don't know that they can say no. So I think that's a great point. If we could start putting that in place from creche level, then kids are aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, we teach children basic things like how to recognize colors, how to recognize shapes, how to say the alphabet. These are basic learning things that we teach them. So alongside that, we also need to teach them how to stay safe, because the traditional mode of parenting assumes that a child would be kept safe by the parent. So they don't actually need to be taught this, that there will always be an adult somewhere nearby them. So if they fall, the adult will go and pick them up, will tell them don't touch the hot stove. But there's, I think, now a need, especially in circumstances like we have in South Africa, where a toddler really, from the age of 2, 3 onwards, needs to be taught some very basic things about how to keep themselves safe. Scream very loudly if you feel that someone is touching you in a way that is inappropriate. Run away from that person. Kick. Do these things. And it's very sad that we have to do this, because children should be left free to just, play. That's exactly it. But now we're having to impose these adult-like sort of situations on them. and it's a reality, so we have to actually do it.
Okay, so Lubna, we know that you're a lecturer and activist, but what else are you involved with? Because I'm sure when it comes to issues like gender-based violence, there's just so much that you probably have to attend to. So just tell our viewers more about what it takes and what it is that you do.
Well, basically, trying to deal with a challenge like gender-based violence requires intervention at multiple levels. So one is, of course, being available at court sites, having an office space where people can come to and speak to you about their problems. We are available online, on social media. We have a hotline as well, a toll-free line. So availability to the public is very important in order to counsel them and to give them advice. But advocacy is also a very important part of the work. So very often I do interviews, with the media to talk about issues, to spread information. We are also part of various events that the Department of Justice, for example, holds, or other NGOs, other civil society organizations. And one of the things we do a lot of, for example, is actually participate in marches and protest activities, demonstrations out there in the public space. As you would be aware, many women's organizations have in the last couple of weeks and months been protesting outside Parliament, outside government houses and so on, because we have a history and tradition of activism and protest in this country. We took on apartheid, and so that kind of a culture of protest is there. But we find that it's actually very effective because that is the one way that one gets listened to. Unfortunately, just basically complaining is not going to do very much. So advocacy work, demonstrations, writing to governments, officials, writing to the media, newspaper articles and so on. So advocacy is a very big part of it. But in addition to that, I do the counseling aspect of it. So for example, if somebody, and we find that a lot of professionals, for example, are being abused or facing some kind of gender-based violence. So I assist in terms of counseling and actually handling cases myself. We also try and go to schools and other institutions where we can speak to people and give them the information.
Okay, so Lubna, there is obviously quite a bit that you're involved in. We'll take an ad break, and when back we can then discuss more with regards to that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Modern and Modest with myself, Noshina Ghani, and Lubna Nadvi. A very informative discussion today on gender-based violence. So Lubna, we were chatting about your involvement and what it is that you do. You can just perhaps give us more of that, and then I'd also like our viewers to maybe get a better understanding of what gender-based violence is.
Sure. So one of the mottos of the organization, the Advice Desk for the Abuse, is 365 days of activism against gender-based violence, because we believe that every day requires one to do something. We have the 16 days of activism in South Africa, which is a focus period, but really one of the critical things is that we need to ensure that every single day, because abuse doesn't just happen between the 25th of November and the 10th of December. It happens throughout the year. So that is one of the things that we actually try and encourage everyone to be alert all the time, to do little simple things that make the difference. Now, if you want to understand what gender-based violence is, it's a complex issue, but effectively what it refers to is sort of physical and emotional and psychological violence that is committed and perpetrated against largely women, but obviously against men as well. So it is done within the context of trying to actually either oppress the person of the opposite gender, humiliate them, exploit them, or harm them in some way, and that is why it is called gender-based violence. We see all different forms of violence in this country: criminal violence, just the regular sort of robberies and muggings, and that happens to anyone. But gender-based violence is very specific because it targets someone because of their gender and very often sexual orientation. So in that sense, it's a very sort of specific form of violence that we can speak about.
Okay. So would you say that the most common type of gender-based violence would be more, some more sexual abuse? Would you say that's the most common type?
Well, we have become very familiar with something called domestic violence, which is the kind of violence that happens between a male and a female living, in a domestic context. So it could be a husband and wife or a couple that's not married and just living in a partnership, or so in a domestic relationship, and that seems to be the most kind of common type of gender-based violence. But what seems to have become even more scary now is sexual violence and sexual assault. So where someone is sexually assaulted, perhaps in a public place or even a private place. It may not be a complete sort of assault in the sense that it is not rape as such, but someone is touched inappropriately or has their clothes torn off or something to that effect. And of course, rape is defined legally in this country as actual sort of penetration or some form of, actual sexual, assault that has given a very specific legal term. Definition. So what we see happening is these kinds of sexual assaults are now on the rise because of the kind of environment that we are living in. Mostly now it's girls that are being impacted upon, in terms of minors, particularly girl children, girl babies, and of course women who are, adult women. So we see that it's become prevalent, particularly in terms of the township communities, but it can happen in any context. But very often you'll find that, little girls are playing out in the townships, or they may be just left at home unattended. So this is becoming a serious problem, and of course, the rapes that are taking place are as a result of these girls being in a vulnerable situation. And that is why I was stressing that even if a girl is left unattended, she must have information that if someone is trying to come and attack her or harm her in any way, she must have the knowledge and the tools to be able to extricate herself from that situation and protect herself. Further to that, gender-based violence can be in the form of, even in an office situation, where a male colleague speaks to a woman colleague inappropriately, or a boss who is a superior is, treating a female colleague inappropriately. So these are the kinds of other forms of violence that could be called gender-based violence, where there isn't necessarily something that is physical or sexual, but it is inappropriate in the way that that interaction happens.
So Lubna, in a professional environment, do you find that, I think women tend to be taken advantage of, maybe by employers or someone in a more superior position? So how would one address a situation like that? Because many times I would think that women are afraid to speak up because it could mean losing your job and that's your income gone. Or how would a woman then be able to stand up for herself to prove that this was inappropriate behavior? Because nobody takes a woman seriously, I would think. So how would you address a situation like that?
Well, we have a lot of legislation in this country that exists to protect women at all levels, and we've also seen that many companies, in fact it's become now quite expected of companies and corporates and all sort of places of employment, for them to have a policy framework, either a sexual harassment policy or a gender-based violence policy that spells out very clearly that if sexual harassment or gender-based violence happens in the workplace, what does that company do? What are the steps that it takes to, for example, handle the matter within the environment, the context of that employer-employee relationship? Anybody who is a victim of gender-based violence can report the matter, because rape is a crime, sexual harassment, they've got a criminal sort of framework within which those issues can be reported at a police station. But sometimes the victim may choose to not go that legal route and may want to deal with it internally within a work environment. So those kinds of mechanisms do exist, and it's very good that they do, because you could have some kind of intervention or a mediation that takes place that doesn't go the legal route. It's not then gone into a court of law where there's a trial or that sort of thing. But that depends on the victim, because or the person who has been subjected to the violence, because they have these options. They have the option to go to a court of law to report the matter, open a case, and so on, or they can choose to deal with it through mediation or some policy framework which exists at their place of employment. For example, you also have situations in schools where a child may be, sort of subjected to gender-based violence by a teacher. So, for example, school governing boards need to have those kinds of policies in place. Any public entity really should have policy frameworks that deal with this, given the realities of our society that we
But
live
I would
in.
think when it comes to your work environment, it doesn't have to necessarily be just the corporates that put it in place. I think every business should be able to put a policy in place, because it could happen to anybody at any given time.
Absolutely. So even if it's just a kind of little sort of shop that sells takeaways, for example. I mean, it might seem like
but it could happen.
Exactly. Those kinds of places should have some policy in place.
Okay, look now, so with recent stats and with us reading online, we find that women here in South Africa are most likely to be killed by their partners. Is this really something that you see? And I know we mentioned earlier that you see quite a bit of domestic violence, so maybe you could give us some insight on that.
Sure. So intimate partner violence is a sort of formal term that is used to actually refer to a husband or a male partner killing his female partner. And sadly, we've seen a spike in this, because what tends to happen is that in any relationship, and of course if you are in the counseling field, or if you are in psychology or any of those counseling areas, we notice that there's a particular pattern which is often referred to as the cycle of violence. So for example, a husband or a male partner may act in a violent way, and he then does something that is violent towards his partner, and then he might feel remorse after that. So he might try to then buy her flowers or take her out or do something to try and make up for it, because there's a sort of sense of, okay, he knows that he's done something wrong. And then she, of course, is shocked by the sort of violence that she's experienced, but she then sees that he's trying to make up for it, so she'll try and give him a chance, and there'll be an attempt from him to try and make up for it, and then they might reconcile or whatever the case may be. So she's giving him some sort of opportunity to sort of be forgiven. And then after a while, because of the nature of the personality that this individual, this male partner is, he will then go and do something violent again, or there'll be a build-up. So he might have some issue that he needs to deal with, and he takes out his violence on his female partner, and then he does something else, like hit her or slap her. And then he realizes he's done something wrong. So the same cycle that I just described carries on and on and on. And that becomes a cycle of violence until this woman realizes that actually she's in an abusive relationship. It is often the case that, in a intimate relationship, there is difference of opinion, there are disagreements. The partners have to learn to work it out, but without violence. They've got to speak through the issues. But when there is violence, and there is physical violence or sexual violence, then that is unacceptable. Before 1998, marital rape, for example, was not recognized as a criminal act. But of course, once the legislation was passed, so there are very often situations where a wife is actually raped by her husband, and that is seen as something that is unacceptable. Although in some cultural contexts it may be seen as, well, a husband is entitled to conjugal sort of,
Right.
you know, services
Yes.
from his female partner. So the point is that in a domestic relationship, these kinds of things happen until the woman realizes and actually accepts and then comes to the conclusion that she has to actually stop this cycle of violence because he's going to continue to do these things.
Yeah.
She's going to continue forgiving him, and then there'll be a period where there'll be some kind of perhaps calm, and then it will build up again, another explosion, another period of remorse, and so on. So this is what we call, there's a term that we call the cycle of violence, and we say break the cycle of violence and break the silence. Because very often women who are going through this, they are scared to talk about it. They can't believe it's happening to them. They don't want their marriages to end. They don't know how else to deal with it.
Well, Lubna, that was indeed very interesting. We'll take an ad break, and when back we can discuss more in depth. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Modern and Modest, and today we're discussing gender-based violence with Lubna Nadvi and myself. So Lubna, we ended off on a very interesting discussion when it comes to women being very accepting of violence or abuse in a relationship. And you touched on many of our Muslim women that are not bold or brave enough to actually step out and speak about what they're experiencing. So how do you feel about this, and how can you help them in perhaps standing up for themselves and letting them know that it isn't acceptable?
Well, I think that the issue of not speaking out is something that impacts on every community, whatever faith group it may be, or cultural, or race group it may be. But I think particularly in the Muslim community, because we are taught certain sort of values about having patience. Make sabr is the usual refrain that is used. That we shouldn't just end a marriage, if at the first sign of trouble, that you've got to work through it. And we do advise that people must try and work out their marriages and their relationships. A divorce is not the natural sort of resolution to a problem. However, if there is ongoing abuse and violence in a relationship, that cannot be sustained. That relationship is not going to work, and so you actually either the couple needs to go for some kind of counseling, so that if there's anger management issues that need to be dealt with, or misunderstandings between the couple that need to be resolved. Couple counseling is very often a very good way of, and it has saved many marriages. So I would certainly say that don't resort to divorce immediately. Try and find solutions to work it out. But if there is a situation where the woman is just being beaten up every weekend or every few days, that is unacceptable. And no religious or theological body should say to that woman, stay in this marriage because this is your fate, or use any kind of religious argument or justification for her to remain in the marriage. Because even in Islam, we are taught that to endure any form of violence is not okay. You've got to actually fight it. So it is very important that our Muslim women empower themselves, and thankfully we've seen more and more of the sisters speaking up. We've seen women organizing themselves, joining women from other communities to stand collectively as sisters and to basically be a support mechanism for each other. So I think that Muslim women have now moved into that space where they realize that they don't actually have to endure the abuse. They can speak about it. It's not a shame. It's not something that you should just keep quiet about. There was a time in our society where we were always posed upon to just keep quiet because what will everyone say? It's shameful to the parents.
I think it had a lot to do with your reputation or your family reputation.
Absolutely, and the thing is that if domestic violence, if sexual assault, if these things are happening in that context, whether it's a Muslim family or a family of any other religious background, that issue has to be dealt with. So you can't use religious arguments to try and hush it up or try and, you know.
I also think that many women, or even men for that matter, stay in these relationships out of fear, because it isn't a relationship, then it's, you know, just being afraid. And I would think the longer they stay in these relationships and you've got children in that marriage, these children tend to witness this, and then it just ends up being a vicious cycle, because kids then feel that it's okay to treat a woman or treat a man in that specific way, and then that just continues. And I'm sure when they grow into adults, and that's the type of behavior that they would mimic.
Well, exactly. This is again part of the cycle of violence, where, for example, a child or someone experienced abuse or witnessed it in their childhood. They grow up then, very often young boys, they grow up then to repeat that same behavior. And so we often try and put out the message that you've got to protect children from either witnessing these kinds of incidences, or basically, if children are vulnerable, to find some form of protection for them. They must be removed from the situation, because, as you said, sometimes people stay in these marriages because maybe there's no other solution for them. The women have nowhere else to go, and they've got these children they've got to take care of. They don't necessarily work, they don't have any form of income. What are they going to do? So leaving an abusive marriage is not as easy as it seems. But that is why there are these organizations out there that exist to say, well, look, you can get the help. Don't assume that you have no access to any kind of assistance. There are many shelters that have come up. So if a woman needs to leave a home for a couple of days, just get herself sorted out. There are shelters that take children as well. So there are these mechanisms out there, and people must actually use them and not just suffer in silence.
And endure that.
Absolutely.
So Livna, where do you think gender-based violence stems from? What are the root causes for gender-based violence?
So like any problem that we have in society, there are also triggers, there are sort of, you know, other causes that you know, cause these things to happen. Gender-based violence really is a phenomenon that exists because of this idea that patriarchy, or the sort of system of male dominance that is out there, presumes that women are weaker, that they can be, you know, oppressed, or they can be treated in any way. So patriarchy has a lot to do with it. It's a kind of structural system which gets taught to particularly boys when they're growing up, that you have certain privileges, you have certain kinds of, you know, special qualities that, you know, you can sort of exhibit or what have you. And especially in households, we see that, for example, the boys get sent out to play and the girls must stay indoors and, you know, wash the dishes and things like that. So from a very early age, boys and girls are taught different things about their roles, but these are all engineered, these are all kind of created, so they're socially engineered kinds of roles. Patriarchy has a lot to do with it. Also in South Africa, I think we have a culture of violence that has developed over a long time. Remember that we came through apartheid. Apartheid was a very violent phenomenon, and we haven't quite resolved it. We haven't broken away from it. If you look at other societies around the world, in Europe in particular, societies where, for example, people are socially sort of, you know, let's call it settled or satisfied, they are employed, they don't suffer from poverty or deprivation or anything like that, you find that there are many, the levels of violence are much lower. Because in South Africa we see a lot of poverty, a lot of inequality, a lot of unemployment, those are also some of the things that contribute to the structural form of violence. So apartheid was one of the sort of, you know, let's call it systems that we haven't quite done away with, because as a consequence of structural apartheid, we now have so much of inequality in this country. People are still suffering from the inequalities and the sort of, you know, the
almost
issues.
as if you can't break away from that.
One can break away from it, but it requires, of course, effort. And of course, our government needs to do more to ensure that the structural effects of those social inequalities, it is really inequality, that some people have so much and some people have so little, and the resources of society are not equally distributed. So you are going to see people who are going to fight over resources, and that then leads to a bigger problem. How do people resolve their anger? How do they deal with their disappointment? They tend to take it out on the vulnerable amongst
the
us.
weaker
So it's the woman, it's the children, it is the babies, and it doesn't justify it. No matter how angry you are because you don't have a job, or you are unemployed, or you are deprived, gives no person any right whatsoever to take out their anger. So, but if you're asking for what some of the reasons are, it's a trigger factor that leads to people behaving in these ways. So I think that once we start dealing with social inequality in South Africa, I think that you will see a marked reduction in gender-based violence. But also we need to deal with the cultural issues. The fact that, as I said, in a patriarchal framework, men are given certain privileges. There are certain sort of cultural and religious, perhaps, privileges that they seem to be given. And we need to challenge those to say...
So Lubna, we... just before we take an ad break, do you find, we chatted about the fact that there's a trigger and I don't have a job. Do you find people are resorting now to human trafficking? I mean, we hear about it. How prevalent is this in Durban? Is that someone being really desperate to find some sort of income, and is that how they get involved in human trafficking? What are the stats here in Durban and how prevalent is it?
So human trafficking is really a consequence of our kind of capitalist commercial system that we have. Very often children are trafficked, or vulnerable people are trafficked from here to sort of spaces overseas. They become sex slaves to rich kind of tourists that go to some of these places in Southeast Asia where they pay very highly for. So it's a business. Sexual trafficking has actually become a business. And what happens is children and minors are very often abducted and put into that sort of system, as are women, because there's a high demand for a sexual sort of services, so to speak, in the kind of spaces where these rich. So that's why I'm saying it's also part of our kind of commercialized capitalist system that exists out there. So it's become an industry, it's become a business. The people who are doing the abductions, the people who are the sort of peddlers of sexual trafficking, they get paid a lot. So that is why. And we've heard stories of how someone would go up to a...
So sorry, Lubna, I'm going to interrupt you. I think this is quite an intense discussion, and there's a lot you can share with us. We'll break for an ad, and when back we can discuss that further. Welcome back to Modern and Modest, and with myself we have Lubna Nadvi, and we are discussing gender-based violence today. So Lubna, we chatted about human trafficking or child trafficking. Maybe share with our viewers what we need to look out for and how this starts out, where does this happen, and how common is this in Durban?
Well, we know that child trafficking, human trafficking, or sexual trafficking, because there's these different aspects of it, are as a consequence of there being a big market out there where human beings are actually sold and trafficked. So how to recognize it in our context? Of course, we have to be very careful when we are out in the public space. We have seen, for example, the rise in abductions of both children and adults, and women in particular. They get abducted, their body gets sort of pumped with drugs, and of course that makes them incapable of actually defending themselves. and they then get trafficked or sent overseas. So we have to actually be always constantly aware of the environment around us. We've heard horror stories of where someone may go up to a woman in a mall and she's carrying a baby or she has a baby in her pram, and he will offer her money for the child. And you know, we've seen these and heard of these horror stories. So it's become a lucrative business to buy and sell human beings, and that's really what it boils down to. So we actually have to be very, very safe and learn to protect ourselves, because it can actually happen to anyone. So you've got to actually be very clear or sure about, you know, your movements, especially in the public space. If you're going out, make sure that someone knows where you're going to. Make sure that you have a phone that works, that your car has petrol if you need to get away. You know, these are all things that we actually now have to do to keep ourselves safe. And little simple techniques of protecting ourselves, we have to ensure that we and teach our family and friends that these are things that we need to do.
Be aware of. I guess just encouraging people to be more alert.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, because you're not even safe in a mall. You just mentioned that
absolutely.
Horrific story.
Yes.
Okay, so Lubna, how can a community get involved, and how can people reach out to you if they're looking for assistance with the counseling that you offer?
Well, the Advice Desk for the Abused is one organization, and I'll give the contact details shortly, but there are so many other ways in which the public and members of the public can actually be involved. First of all, they need to educate themselves regarding what is actually going on. So you need to know, for example, what the statistics are. People do often open newspapers or, you know, turn on their televisions and they see these stories. But it's important to actually educate yourself about the actual causes and what the statistics are, because I mean, there's sensational news that's out there, and people can very often get despondent about things and say, well, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to sit quietly and just, you know, the news will keep on coming and I'm not going to do anything about it. But for example, if you are somehow suspecting that, say, there's some issue happening in your immediate environment, in your neighborhood, you know, make an effort to actually find out what's going on. Not that, you know, I'm saying go and snoop or you know, pry, but very often someone's life can be saved because someone took the trouble to care for that person. We talk about, for example, stories where if there's, say, fighting happening in the sort of flat neighboring yours, we've had campaigns which we call the Ring the Doorbell campaign. So what would happen is the neighbor who's hearing the fighting next door would go and just ring the doorbell, constantly ring the doorbell. And it was as if it was alerting the man inside that room that, look, someone knows that you are doing this, right? And then he would stop. So I'm just using that as a simple example, but it requires us to actually go and make the effort. If we see someone who's constantly coming to work with bruises, find out about what's going on with that person. Even if she is afraid to say anything, make yourself available to someone who is going through difficulties. Also build up some kind of a resource or database on your phone, or, you know, just write down numbers of organizations that offer help. There are quite a few that are across the country. So once you build up these resources, arm yourself with knowledge and information, make an effort to find out what's going on around you, whether it's your immediate neighbor, your colleague, your family member. So you are actually an active role player. You're a citizen that is, you know, making a difference. You're not just sitting and, you know, listening to it all. And also have a resource base that you can just, you know, open your phone up and say, okay, here's the number for this. Please call them, or I'm going to call them and make an appointment for someone, you know, to seek help. So these are the ways in which just every single person can make a difference. We live such busy lives. We really don't have time to be going and trying and, you know, solving the problems of the world. But there are very simple things that everyone can actually do. Also, try and see if you can be active every day of the week, if possible. So most of us are on Facebook, for example, or some form of social media. If you are going to post something about useful information that will help somebody. So every day, if you are going to be on social media, use it as an opportunity to do something useful. We have these people called influencers who are constantly selling us things or what have you. Let us convert those kinds of spaces into platforms where useful information to protect us, to try and address the problems that we face.
I also think, well, that's a key point, because if you create that awareness on social media platforms, it also allows that individual to be able to speak about it, where you know that it is there and it's not just happening to that person, you know.
Absolutely.
So you sort of feel a little bit more comfortable, or you can build up that courage to be able to seek the help that's
Absolutely.
available.
If we look at the kinds of issues or cases that we've seen happening, for example, this young woman from Cape Town, she just went to the post office and she was murdered by someone who worked there. Now, you would never expect that to happen, because we all go to the post office and we think it's a safe space. So this is the thing about the kinds of things that are happening out there. We need to actually ensure that we, as I said, try and have greater security mechanisms whenever we're out in the public space. If we're going to just do a simple task, make sure that someone knows where you're going to, or go with someone.
Yes.
We can't always have someone escort us somewhere, but the point is that try and take greater sort of care, or have some mechanisms in place. Also, I think that in light of what's happening in this country, there's these campaigns that have, or these hashtags that have come out, like Men Are Trash, or the Me Too campaign and so on, where there is this focus on males, on men who are committing and perpetrating these acts of violence. And there's a lot of anger out there.
Yes.
Women are angry, and justifiably so. So we need to then ask our male compatriots to actually take more responsibility. And thankfully we've seen in the last, few weeks and months, where men have actually spoken out and come out and said that, look, we can't allow our gender or our fellow men to be behaving in this way, so we need to do something about it. So I really think that this is not just a woman's problem. Women can't be the ones marching outside Parliament and making a big noise. Actually, society has to join hands, men and women. People from all backgrounds have to actually join hands to say this is a serious problem.
Yeah, I think it's also a sort of collective effort that you're making towards putting things right.
I talk about dealing with gender-based violence as if it is a health epidemic. For example, if when we were dealing with HIV/AIDS or the Ebola or flu virus.
Okay, Lubna, with gender-based violence being on such a high, there's just so much that we can discuss, and unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up our show, but we look forward to bringing you back soon. But just for our viewers to get in touch with you, could you perhaps share your contact details with us?
Sure. So the Advice Desk for the Abused has an email address. It's the info@advicedesk.org.za, and we also have a WhatsApp number which you could call. The number is 081 006 4633, and of course we have a Facebook page, so you can go onto Facebook and look for Advice Desk for the Abused. We also have a Twitter account which is at Advice Desk SA. So we are on social media, and people are welcome to contact us. I would also suggest that people do make the effort to go online to the government websites and a lot of the other sort of Department of Justice websites where there is information for organizations other than the Advice Desk.
Well, shukran for watching our episode today on Modern and Modest with Lubna Nadvi. That was indeed a very informative discussion. And just a message from myself to you, enough is enough. And as Lubna discussed with us earlier, that I don't think we should be accepting of any violence, and once you accept it, it becomes a vicious cycle that tends to be difficult to break. So just be strong and fearless, and until next week, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.